me a little bit about yourself, sir.
Had a very interesting life to start with. Father died when I was 2 years old. Mother had 6 kids at that point. No financial plan. Family broke apart. My baby sister got adopted out. My 2 older brothers and 2 older twin sisters and myself ended up in the Catholic orphanage. Spent 4 to 12 in the orphanage, came out. We lived in a 2-bedroom apartment, Upper West Side, the real West Side story. Dragons up the block, Egyptian kings around the corner, Fordham Baldies, assassins, bishops, very, very gang-oriented world at that particular point. Survived that. My mother was strong enough and good enough to arrange for scholarships for me at the parochial schools, and I got a pretty solid education. That got me off to college. She was doing the tuition plan until she got robbed in the subway. I then took over my education from her contribution and ended up completing a bachelor's and a master's degree in clinical social work, basically psychotherapy studies. So I'm in private practice, odd practice of financial planning, tax work, and psychotherapy.
What led you to come up with this curriculum?
Well, there were probably a number of good forces coming together at the same time. I had long been a very, very serious student of the work of Rollo May, an existential psychoanalyst, that I just happened upon him discovering his book Love and Will at the library, and that led to me basically finding and reading everything that he wrote wherever I could find it. And one of the books that ended up being very, very important to me was a book called Power and Innocence, and it was subtitled The Search for the Sources of Violence. Well, it turned out in the late 1980s, early 90s, when I decided to go back into social work, I ended up working for a small family counseling agency in Monroe, Michigan. And they had a domestic violence program, a contract with the local courts. And the person who was running it decided to go elsewhere, and they were looking around for somebody to take up the work. So I did. I suggested that I do that, but I needed to do it on my own terms. I had a particular idea that I wanted to work on, and if they let me do that, I'd be happy to do the program, and they agreed. And that idea was, if individuals resort to violence because they find themselves powerless, how could we help them become more powerful so that they didn't have to resort to that particular way of doing things? And at the time, it was a radical idea because people who were convicted of domestic violence were simply considered as thugs, and there's nothing to do except control them. That was going on, and at the same time, I was doing a good deal of work with the Landmark Forum, formerly Werner Erhardt's S program. And they had an interesting idea that they started talking about domination and the avoidance of domination. One of their ideas was everywhere, all the time, under all circumstances, who we are as human beings is the avoidance of domination. And I took that idea and said, yeah, that's true for human beings. Now, let's look at this in terms of getting what you want. And as I played with the idea, that seemed like, yeah, you can use force, and that has domination all over it. And manipulation, stealing, lying, that had domination all over it. But what were the other ones? And I just began to take my guesses at that. One being, well, you can do a deal. People do deals and they get what they want. And if everybody does the deal from the right point of view, they keep their agreements, people can do more deals. So no domination associated with that. And then what seemed to be the hardest one to get was the idea that we could ask for it, even though it was the simplest one. And yet, thinking about it, most children get barked at when they constantly pester the parents about, can I have this? Can I do that? Can we do? At a certain point, they get told not to make any more requests, and it becomes anxiety-provoking to even make a request. But thinking about that, I thought, yeah, that looks right. There are only 4 ways to get what you want from another person: request, deal, manipulation, and force. The only variation I made on that, which was my variation, was manipulation was the boundary line. There was such a thing as a good manipulation and a bad manipulation. Good manipulation's working on the other person's mind to advance your own interest that doesn't do damage over there, like Expressions of love facilitate doing deals and making requests. Acknowledgement encourages the person to give you what you want because they can feel that you're on side. But it has to be genuine. If it's fake, if it's done for the purpose of trying to suck up, it already becomes immediately a negative manipulation. Negative manipulations, same thing, trying to get influence on the other person for your own interests, but it does damage. Guilt, shame, threats of force, put-downs, attacks on self-esteem, all of those in some ways trying to weaken the person to surrender to your will. So that became the core of what I started to do in the domestic violence program. Well, this idea of the 4 ways of getting what you want from another person seemed to me an important piece in terms of the domestic violence. That almost seemed obvious. If I could help my clients become better able at making requests, better able at putting together deals, and being more conscious of being able to acknowledge the people in their lives, it would make it more likely that they would not end up having to use violence. And that's essentially what I did during the 90s. Request people who are in powerful relationships get most of what they want by simple request. A child asking something of a parent, 2 young people getting together, young lovers, they can get most of what they want or need just simply by request. Deals are natural. We are doing deals constantly during the day, whether it's for groceries or for a mortgage on a house. So it's a natural place to go, but there are qualifications that make it truly a deal. It must be at least fair from each person's point of view what the exchange is, and at the same time, both parties have to keep their side of the agreement. If they don't, it automatically becomes a manipulation and a negative manipulation. The expression, "he just got played," gives you that certain sense of that you were being used as a thing, not as a human being. And then obviously manipulations, the IRS in its own way gives you a deduction for taking somebody out to a nice meal. It sets an environment where you can maybe do some business, cut some deals, put some deals together. But it's also a dividing line. In our everyday usage of the term manipulation, it has a very, very bad connotation. You're doing something to play somebody and get them in a certain kind of way. So it's a dividing line. One has domination associated with it, the other one has care associated with it. And the use of force, court of last resort, of course, you take it or you set up a future negative manipulation that I'm going to use force again, unless you comply. Well, I did this for the 90s, and I continued in the 2000s with my studies. I signed up for a psychoanalytic training program that extended over 9 years. Worked with a guy by the name of Jack Novick, who began to speak about omnipotence and the omnipotent fantasy as part of what causes people to get crazy. But that idea of omnipotence and my own ideas about power began to come together, and I began to think about it, and it seemed simple to me in its own way. People who can get what they want and need are generally content. But if you can't get what you want and need, and it's very important, then you get depressed. And on the other hand, if there's a situation that's going to arise in the future and you don't think that you can avoid it, or you don't think that you can get it if you really want it, that's a state of anxiety. So it seemed to me important to be able to work with individuals to help them better understand the role of power in their life, being able to get what they want and need. At the same time, I became very, very interested in the question of reality. We are living in our own realities, and again, part of the work I did with the Landmark Group is that they would make a distinction between the what so, what scientists would call the objective world, and the story, meaning, understanding, or interpretation, what philosophers call the subjective side. And their idea was that it came together in the instant, that when we encounter the world, we encounter it as a what so, but in the very instant, our subjective way of seeing it attaches to it, and that becomes our reality. So what you know and believe passionately is your truth is your reality, and you its prisoner. And I say that because when children are making up their ideas of the world, they decide it at age 6 or 7, and it becomes final language. Part of psychotherapy is to discover what that final language is and to open it up. It's not for the therapist to impose a change on that, But the idea of therapy is you get to have a perspective on who you are that you can't have yourself, and thereby increase the possibilities of how you can address the world. So the upshot of the work that I'm doing currently is helping individuals confront their history, the psychological work that Freud did originally, but also how can you begin to start developing the skills necessary to be able to get to what you want and need in your life. So it seemed to me that the primary task of the therapist is the increase of freedom. That seems always central. I think any good therapy must have as its goal the increase of an individual's possibilities. And the second piece, what the classical therapists like to talk about as agency, I like to really speak about it in pure terms of power, being able to increase an individual's capacity to get what they want and need as a way of being able to move forward. The only caveat I have, which I constantly work with this, again goes back to what the Noviks talked about in terms of their ideas of omnipotence. You can't always get what you want, as the Rolling Stones would say. And I think that that's part of it. That's part of learning how to grieve. That's learning how to accept your certain mortality. It's an idea of being able to say, yes, there are going to be times in your life where you're going to be disappointed, but can you get essentially most of what you want and need? That's ultimately what I think I try to take my clients to. Can I help you to begin to get involved with something passionately that expresses your creative self so that you actually can make a contribution to the wider community? So that's really what I think therapy is about, is helping individuals, and as I suggested, develop social interests, a social conscious, but also to do that in a powerful, creative way. That's what I'm really trying to get accomplished in my work in life.